I have the benefit of working with a lot of great people, and really it's pretty simple of what we're trying to accomplish, and it's kind of similar to what BIM is trying to accomplish. But really, I get the privilege of working with people to talk and discuss with some leading ideas of how can we move the industry forward. I think that overall there's a lot of agreement that the design and construction industry is fragmented, contentious, and not as efficient as it can be. And what Consensus Docs is about is how can we work together, communicate, and collaborate to come up with best practices, fair risk allocation, so we can get a project to get better project results for an owner, for a contractor, for design professional, and everybody who's a stakeholder to the industry. And it's my great privilege to work with a lot of people and trying to volunteer a lot of their time to try to make that happen. So I think BIM, it'll be interesting. We get into a little bit about the relationship between what BIM is as a tool as well as the industry as how it's moved from this fragmented process, or I should say moving, because it really hasn't totally happened, but a fragmented process of everybody in their own niches protecting their own individual interest and risk profiles, which is pretty important for today's discussion because we're talking about contracts and risk, and how we need to we're opening up and everything is sort of trending in a similar direction where collaboration, communication is seen as a better way forward to try to get better project results. And why are we moving in that direction? Why do we have to maybe step outside some of our comfort zone of what we've been doing before from our contract or risk profile and maybe change things up a little bit? I think it's because BIM a lot of times provides the incentive for collaborating because you can get more benefits from communicating early on and collaborating throughout the process by using the powerful tool that BIM represents. And with that, I will toss it back to you.
Thank you. And this is really the heart of what we hear from so many of our clients. Brian just hit on so many of those topics, so we're going to get into that quite a bit more deeply in the coming minutes. RJ, can you have a background, really the hands-on background here, along with Brian Juge, and developing projects and seeing through from the design phases clear through construction. Can you kind of give us a little bit of your thoughts on this?
Yes. First of all, similar to what Brian said, thanks to everybody for participating today. It's good to be part of a process where we're trying to evolve the entire industry, so that's nice. For my own part, I come at this discussion from, I guess, what you could say, an in-the-trenches point of view, if you will. I've been a practitioner for nearly 20 years now in various stages of the process. When I started out, I was what you would call the right-hand man in a small commercial firm. The principal would bring in the napkin sketch and drop it on the desk, and it was up to me to figure out what to do, where to go with it, and how to make it happen. And of course, initially that was 2D CAD drafting back in AutoCAD 12 and 14. And then as the softwares and hardwares of the world evolved, it was always my intention to stay on top or near the top of the learning curve in the arc and adoption of new technology. So when architectural desktop ADT came out and got sophisticated enough, we moved into that for actual construction documentation. And then, of course, I stepped out of that role and into a role of an owner of a small firm where we were doing commercial architecture for numerous clients across the country, primarily hospitality-based. And at the inception of that partnership, we made the decision to make the jump to Revit as our platform, not only for preliminary design, but all the way through construction documentation at that time. And it turned out to have been a mixed blessing, as so many people who are listening in probably know, where you bleed a lot at first, but eventually you get through and then you realize where all of the efficiencies are. So I did perform that for a matter of 3 years as the principal, as the contract negotiator, writer, and of course one of my main roles was figuring out just exactly what level of granularity, what level of promised deliverable was necessary within the context of not only the contract but the technology that was available at the time. Then I jumped from there to doing federal contracting in a design-build format. And I performed 2 years of work for the largest corporation we have, the federal government, primarily the Army Corps of Engineers and the, other associated branches of our armed forces, anywhere from Texas to California, Colorado, of course. And that entity, being unique, the federal government, they brought a fascinating mix of adoption of BIM and contract language to the table in its own right. And it certainly gave me a fair number of curveballs that I hope to be able to give some learning experience to everyone listening today. So what I bring to the table is a small to medium firm contract setup, technology setup, vis-a-vis the BIM deliverables today, as opposed to the other two distinguished panelists who are far more litigious in their background than I am. I'm far more experienced in that. That's where I come from.
RJ, thanks. I think that was what was important to Brian, Juge, and I as we set this up, was to make sure that we had this range of experiences available to talk to this, because most of the firms that we deal with are small to medium-sized firms in this area. They face a lot of these same questions. They're looking at contract issues. They're looking at AIA E202 and consensus docs and saying what should I be making of this? Brian, Brian Juge, do you want to have any additional comments before we start in some of the Q&A here?
Yeah, I think that's important to point out what Stan was saying. And I'm with RJ. I'm probably a little bit less on the legality portion of it, but a little bit more in the current day-to-day. Not that you aren't, RJ, but with the small firms and stuff. My background has been in that particular realm, and mainly in hospitality and some government, but not as much. But the trenches, the work out there. So who's doing the model? How is that being passed from one entity to another? But what I really wanted to get out of this too was to focus in that this isn't just a big firm issue, and I think it applies to medium and small firms and what's coming up. And I just wanted to definitely have that in the back of our mind, because everybody thinks of this. They think of IPD. They think of BIM deliverables, and they're thinking, oh, only the big guys handle this. And I would disagree with that, and I think my panelists would agree with me too, that this is going to be something that everybody's going to start looking at and at least taking some portions of it with them. So I believe with that we'll just start rolling into some of these questions here. Sounds and just good. get it moving. So the first question is what is the role of the owner, the architect, and the contractor? And I think we'll start with Janet.
And Janet,
yeah, and
go ahead, Janet.
Well, I've agreed to take the position of the owner in today's discussions,
right.
Partly because a lot of my clients are owners, public and private owners, developers, builders, and so I can focus on what kinds of issues I think are very important from the owner's perspective, whereas I think that Brian Pearlberg is going to be better able to address the view of the contractor, and RJ the perspective of the design professional. So I will be citing from the perspective of the owner, and I think one of the important things to remember when you're talking about an owner and an IPD project is that I think the difference between the selection of integrated project delivery as a project delivery model and design build as a project delivery model is it's pivotal on who the owner is and how sophisticated the owner is. If you're going to have an integrated project delivery system, you have to have an owner who is relatively sophisticated and absolutely involved in the project from day one. They have to take an active role in, along with the design professionals and the contractor in making decisions at every point along the way. And if you have an owner in an IPD project who's not either experienced enough or not willing to take an active role as as part of the decision-making process, then I think that that owner can actually harm the integrated project delivery method of presentation. So it's absolutely critical that you have a very involved owner who is experienced, qualified, and willing to take on that role. If you have an owner that is not experienced and or not sophisticated enough to take on that role as a full participant, then I think that it's much better to do a design-build form of project delivery system where the owner takes a much less involved role and the contractor and design professional take a stronger role, and then they can do integrated project delivery just among themselves if they want to. But that role of the owner is critical if you're going to have an integrated project delivery system, and if the owner isn't fully engaged, it can actually, I think, hurt the process.
Janet, one of the go ahead.
No, that was the end of my comment there. Go ahead.
Well, one of the questions that I had for you, because we've talked a few times in the past, and you have some, real, fairly strong and really valid feelings about, IPD being this project that becomes kind of the corporate entity or the legal entity that everyone is a partner in versus the cultural aspect of IPD, and that's something you can address. And then Brian Pearlberg, tell me about that.
Well, I think it's really important to view this discussion as three different components. One component is the concept of collaboration as a cultural shift in the design and construction industry. Another focus is integrated project delivery as a contract format. And the third area that I think we've touched on and will touch on is using software as a tool to aid the parties in their collaboration and their collaborative efforts. So you have a culture, you have a contract, and you have a software discussion. I think that IPD as a contract format is really, I don't know that much about software and technical issues, but I can certainly speak to the contract format. And I think that there's basically some people would have you believe that integrated project delivery has to be a three-party contract or a multi-party contract. It absolutely doesn't. You can have collaboration in a two-party contract or a three-party contract. You have to recognize that if you don't pick the right people to be part of your team, you're not going to have collaboration, and it doesn't matter what kind of contract you have, and that you can have a three-party contract, and if the participants are not collaborative, the process isn't going to work. So if you don't have the right participants in the team, it doesn't matter what your contract looks like. The AIA has two different approaches to the integrated project delivery method. One, which I support strongly, is a series of two-party IPD contracts that allow for the incorporation of a lot of the cultural issues around collaboration, bringing the contractor and the sub-consultants into the process early, getting the owner engaged in the process from the very beginning. Those types of things can be done with two-party contracts that are structured with various ways to share risks and rewards within two-party contracts, and incentives, and the use of contingencies and things like that, where you don't have to have three parties, you can just have two parties. From a legal perspective, I think a three-party or multi-party contract is dangerous, and it really isn't necessary. You can achieve the same kinds of contract terms in two-party contracts. But I think that what I often hear when people talk about integrated project delivery is they want collaboration and they want sharing of risks and rewards, and then the next step is they want limitation of liability clauses, and they want to create a single-purpose LLC. Well, those concepts are really not compatible, because sharing risks and rewards is just the opposite of limiting liability and creating a single-purpose LLC. those types of structures are meant to shed liability, not share liability. So I think that if you have the right contract terms and the right parties with the right culture, you're going to have a successful project, and you don't have to have multi-party contracts. I think that having a BIM execution plan is probably the single most important document that you can create. And that, I think that probably the best BIM execution plan is a combination of the E202 from the AIA documents and the BIM Addendum from Consensus Docs, which both come at the BIM execution plan with some great concepts, and if you combine those into a BIM execution plan and have the right project participants, you're going to have a really successful project, and it doesn't require having a multi-party contract.
Janet, thank you. RJ, being the architect, you know, and we don't necessarily have to stick to the legal issues here. You can talk about some of the cultural issues you found, or even software issues. But, you know, carrying forward on what Janet has commented on, how do you see the role of the architect in the model-based design process?
Well, first of all, I'd like to go back to a couple of interesting items that Janet mentioned. I wholeheartily agree with her that a savvy owner, if you will, is very important, and a participatory owner is very important. And at the time, Janet, you mentioned those two items, and I started saying I'd like to, in my own head, add one more critical piece, but you kind of then did get back to the third piece of the puzzle, is that you have to have an owner who is intending to use collaboration in a positive fashion. Sometimes, unfortunately, it is possible to have an owner who is participatory and who is knowledgeable, but actually does not use those in a collaborative fashion, that has a tendency to use that kind of in a more punitive fashion, where they're kind of keeping score within the context of the IPD, and then they come back later and use that, of course, as pieces and parts to be able to pick you apart on what you may not have done or may have missed or didn't do in your scope. Have you ever encountered that situation occur where you had someone who had less than stellar motivations?
Well, you know, I think that we've all acknowledged that the industry needs to move away from the contingent adversarial type of relationship and towards a more collaborative culture. And you know, I don't think it's just limited to owners who can come to the process with a self-interest in mind rather than the interest of the project. I just think there's a lot of ways to move the industry towards a project-centered focus. I think lean construction techniques are wonderful. They have just a whole gamut of things that are good at building trust and creating good teamwork, getting people to move outside their silos. So it could be an owner who's adversarial. It can be an architect who's very protective and defensive. It can be a contractor who's just looking to create their own individual profit centers within the project. So it's just not limited to the owner. I think we've all got to recognize as an industry the value of moving away from that towards a more collaborative culture.
No, I do fully agree with you that it isn't just limited to the owner. You're absolutely correct. My fine point was only that I've had an unfortunate experience of my own wherein the owner in question had those first two ingredients, but and it was within a more collaborative contract, and it should have been a positive experience in that fashion, but then that person reverted to a more traditional silo approach like you alluded to, and I was just wondering if you'd encountered that regression, I guess, as the project evolved down the road.
Well, you know, I can't really say that I can point to a specific instance like you had, RJ, but I also think that this idea of integrated project delivery is really kind of in its infancy, and I can't really point to that many projects that have actually been finished under this project delivery method. There's a lot of projects out there that are started it or considered it or maybe halfway through, but we're really in the very early stages of finding out projects that actually get all the way through it to the end with a completed project using integrated project delivery, and then had you know, a good experience. Another thing we don't have much of is projects that went through the integrated project delivery method and then the system broke down because of not being able to meet the targeted budget or not being able to meet the owner's requirements. We haven't really seen that play out yet because it's just such a new process.
Agree. Stan, you asked me to speak a little bit from a position of an architect within the context of the pratfalls, or if you will, the problems that develop with these processes, and also the positive aspects of these types of collaboration. I can only speak from my own personal opinion, but the architects that I've worked with and known over the years, and of course the design professionals as an extension of that, they really do want to see a more collaborative approach, because in the end, if everyone's working together, the process is smoother, the profits are preserved, the litigation or liabilities are removed or reduced. So it definitely is something that BIM-based design speaks towards very positively. It should be something that can be embraced within that contractual arrangement, if you will. It's something that definitely needs to happen and is happening. But as Jenna just alluded to, it's really at the beginning point of actual, follow through of actually happening. So
yeah.
Well,
what else? Go ahead, Stan.
Let me ask Brian Pearlberg from his perspective, as a kind of a national representative. What do you see out there across the board, and then we can kind of keep the discussion going from there.
Sure. A couple of things, and I'm kind of somewhat anxious to jump in, but I wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to talk, because I think there's been a lot of interesting points that have been made, and I wanted to jump in. By way of background, and I probably should have mentioned this in the onset, is that Consensus Docs was formed, and I mentioned it was originally 20 organizations. It's now up to 35. But one of the signature things that we did, we first we met for 3 years working on this, but it was in September of 2007 when we published our first set of construction contract documents. And among that family was the Consensus Docs 300 agreement, which was the first published standard integrated project delivery document. And we called it a collaborative project delivery. Now we've changed it to IPD because that's taken on a secondary meaning in the industry. And then in 2008, we were the first to publish a standard building information modeling BIM document, which was the Consensus Docs 301. And that was another groundbreaking effort, and it was a lot of, I think I mentioned about the excitement. People were sort of chomping at the bit to get it out there. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that distinguishes Consensus Docs, I think, is inherent in the BIM Addendum, is that we are trying to figure out a fair risk allocation, roles and responsibilities, and give some guidance as to how best practices is how to get there on a project. So a couple of things. One question that comes to mind that really comes up a lot is the conversation we've been somewhat having on the fringes is, what's the relationship between IPD and BIM? And another way of saying it more specifically that I hear is, do you need to have an IPD contract to use BIM? And maybe I'm jumping the gun in our conversation with some other things, but I think it's important to note, since we've sort of started to have this conversation, is that I think we would all agree that absolutely not. You do not need an IPD agreement to use BIM. Now, an IPD agreement, as I was alluding to before, gives you the incentive to use BIM, and the benefits of using BIM are perhaps significantly greater by taking an integrated approach with your contract and your process. But a lot of people, a lot of contractors use BIM, little BIM, for just clash detection. And we can kind of get into that, but a little bit more. A lot of architects use it for the design model, but then give paper documents. A lot of owners try to use BIM for facilities management, and they may have an integrated model or not. So that's just one thing that I wanted to talk about. Now, I'm a bit of a purist, but there's two things here. There's BIM as far as it's a powerful tool, and it's not just software, but it's essentially, I see it as a tool, whereas IPD is a process. And you are correct. There's a lot of, the number of signed IPD contracts is not overwhelming. There's a couple of models. Janet mentioned that there's two different AIA models. The first one that I think AIA has characterized as a transitional document for IPD, I would beg to differ pretty strongly that that is not IPD. That's not intended by LCI. That does not provide the integration and collaboration. That is just simply design assist, and it's been done for decades, and it's nothing new. It's early involvement of contractors. It's a positive thing, but it's not IPD. IPD is, there's three prongs for truly doing IPD, and I do believe, I'm more of a purist, as I said, I think you need to have the signed contracts, because actually I think that you were onto something, RJ. You mentioned how there's a retrenchment from owners who you thought that they were going to be collaborative, but sometimes the contracts provides the structure to ensure or help make sort of tie people's performance and risks and rewards together in a binding fashion. Whereas that if you have it in sort of a design assist or types of things, you have the possibility of getting collaboration, but it's also very easy when the inevitable sticky issue arises on a construction project, that retrenchment. If you have, say, like a GMP, you know, people's risks and rewards are much different when their performance and money incentives is tied on their specific contract. And that goes to another point, is that we're talking design assist, design build. There are varying different degrees, I think, of collaboration that ties you. But certainly design bid build would be an example of what I would call a transactional contract. And what IPD is going at is a relational contract. So it's it's what's sometimes in a transaction contract, what's good for me is bad for you. What's bad for you is good for me. You can certainly see that a lot with subcontractors who have a lot of incentives to speed up their performance so they can perform and then get off the site, but that can actually mess up the production methods. So again, I didn't really finish the thought, but the three prongs of a successful IPD, structuring an IPD contract are the commercial terms with the risk and rewards. It's setting up the correct organizational structure as the second prong. And the third is the operating system to implement the lean tools like tool planning and real-time delivery of deliverables for the construction site to ensure that you have the most effective delivery. But I also want to be very clear is that one of the fundamental, may I ask somebody if there's some background noise, you might want to put your telephone on mute. But what I was going to say is that it's very good to collaborate, and if I had a choice between the best contract and the worst team versus the worst team and the best contract, I would always take the better team. So it's not getting the right contract's not a panacea here. So both are very important, and then getting the right teams. The essential feature one is you should try to get the right qualifications. You should try to build trust amongst the different teams, and you have to have the right culture of the risk and rewards that the parties are seen as their performance is tied to one another. Because if they're seen as their performance is separate, a win for me is a loss for you, or vice versa, or they're not seen as tied to the results of the overall success, that's when you get the retrenchment and people going into their traditional models. But at the same time, design build is certainly transitional, that allows for collaboration. CM at Risk does that too. IPD just does that in a more structured fashion where you're actually obligated to work together, but also some of those lean tools and real-time production methods and learning process as part of a project. That is what you need if you want to have the full benefit of the integration and the collaboration. And then BIM is really a big incentive to get a system where you're getting the real-time iterative process going for collaboration. And also the increased need for people who want to do green buildings also benefit from getting the LEED certification. There's a lot of iterative approaches that require early involvement of contractors and the back and forth for the building systems to be done right. So that's why things are trending this way. But I do think that's a little, so there's sort of a contract structure, and there's a collaboration incentive, but I do agree with what everybody said is that that it's great to have a good team, it's great to work to collaborate, but I do think that's a little bit of a different discussion between an IPD contract versus can we use BIM or not.
Thank you very much, Brian. Kind of getting into the next one. How would you guys describe what is the workflow for assigning deliverables once the contract parameters have been set in a BIM-based project? We've kind of gone through and talked about it seems like everybody's kind of gone through their opinions on the documents themselves, but what is the workflow? How is the workflow going to flow from one person to the next as far as if we were to use an IPD system as the contract that we're going to be discussing? So start with you, RJ. What do you think about that?
And let me apologize before you start, RJ. I think the little bit of background noise is actually, Janet is graciously joined us, but she's sitting in the hospital waiting for the grandchild to be delivered, and I think it's picking up a little of the noise from the hospital, so we're sorry about that. But no problem.
I apologize for that. Let me see if I can figure out how to mute.
No, don't worry about it.
Don't worry about that, Janet.
Okay.
So, RJ, you there, RJ?
I think you've muted RJ, actually. There's a little arrow, a red cross next to his microphone, so if there's a way to maybe undo it.
Yeah,
he might have muted too.
He might have muted too.
Brian, why don't you go ahead and answer some of that same thinking there from your point of view, and we'll get RJ back online here.
Okay, well, so I'm not the expert to talk about the sort of the work process for the development of the model and the BIM models, but one of the things that's really important that I think that in talking about, in developing the BIM Addendum, so I was part of the effort the national effort to develop the BIM Addendum. It was led by a lot of national experts, but I was involved in that process and staffed it. And one of the things that was really a eureka moment in developing the document and trying to figure this out, not only like coming up with the definitions, which was really important to try to have some standardization, but was really figuring out like BIM and like the workflow of that there is not, I guess I'm sort of jumping a little bit ahead, but that there's not one BIM model as like your one integrated BIM model for the most part.
That's
you have the
important.
design model, you have the contractors model, you have the specialty contractors, the MEP models, and that those are separate models, design models separate, but then we set it up so that there's the federated model. So we defined design model, the contractors model, specialty contractors, and that the federated model is all the models together that are federated, that are then flashing together for a more detailed model. So there could be a part that's more detailed to have a different level of development than another part of the overall project and the overall model, but the objects could have certainly varying degrees of detail. But when you flash them together, that is what's really thought of as the federated model, and that's a really important concept, both as a definition, but also as the development of the BIM Addendum, Consensus Docs 301.
I think one of the things, Brian, that you've brought up there that's important is that just the fact that, and we see this a lot in our industry, is just the fact that, one of the efficiencies that should be able to be gained by the BIM process, the VDC process, model-based design, etc., is everybody's been BIM to death, and it's gotten kind of weird meanings to it. So, I kind of like to use model-based design sometimes as well. But the point being that you want to gain the most efficiency out of the model as it's developed, so that as you move through the different levels of development, you're not having to go back to the start necessarily and start over again each time you need a new model. Say you've got the contractor's model and you hand that off to the owners for O&M and facilities. You don't want to lose a lot of the intent of the model. You want to be able to build on the good data that's there and be able to extract that. So that's an interesting issue. RJ, what do you kind of see as a process for developing the deliverables and talking about that?
Stan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I don't know what happened. I just sat there and everything muted on me, and I didn't touch anything. It's kind of bizarre. Anyway.
Welcome to technology.
Yeah, you got to love it. Well, one of the first things you've got to do is you got to assess what your team's capabilities are. It's critical. I think what Brian said a little bit earlier is you'd rather have a good team and a bad contract than a good contract and a bad team. That's the fact.
That's important.
You got to go, team member by team member in the companies that are involved, and be able to know and assess what their capabilities within the BIM format are. I've had just the entire gamut from guys who don't know what BIM is to pretty darn savvy on with it, mechanical subs. It just really kind of depends. The first thing you have to do is assess the capabilities of each member on the team, because you're going to have to find a way, if some of them are less capable, of filling the holes where they're not. And a lot of this has to do with project change-out, or contract change-out, I should say. The best guys have a tendency to be more expensive. So what happens is someone will come in with another company and they'll be able to save some contract sum, but the frequently forgotten item in that is you're probably giving up some capability somehow. And often it's BIM, because that's one of the newest components. So first you have to find out that. Next, of course, you have to revisit the contract language, the finalized signed contract language, and see just exactly what is included within the context of BIM. For example, in private development industry, often the contracts used are still the more basic traditional AIA, let's say, contract between the owner and the architect, and then maybe or maybe not, they might add the BIM organization subset. But more often than not, in the private sector, I found that the owner is often not savvy enough to understand granularity and levels of involvement of the BIM. So you have to be careful of that. Now, in the government sector, unfortunately, I've encountered the opposite.
Yeah.
Where, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers, not to denigrate them because they are doing their best considering the immense challenges they have, but they have a tendency to try to write the granularity into the RFP for the BIM model before the contract is even signed, and they'll go to great lengths. They won't use the available documents from either AGC or AIA. They'll try to write their own document content for what the BIM model level will be. And of course, the paraphrasing gets very dangerous in a hurry because it doesn't really necessarily match up with exactly what the technology can offer. So that's the second thing you really have to take care of when you're getting started on the deliverables process. Let's see, looking here at my notes, the software is basically set up so that the architect is kind of the lead BIM coordinator with LinkedIn models from the other design professionals, more or less. So it's pretty critical that the architect is Johnny on the spot in getting the process rolling to begin with upfront assignment of scheduled updates, postable updates to the BIM model as it evolves. You need to get that framework set at the beginning of the process. Otherwise, it's unclear to everyone what is delivered by when. And when you get that schedule set up, you really need to have the time scheduled in to ensure that once everyone is posted, there is time to finish the coordination and finish the back checking prior to each particular milestone. So that's an upfront thing you have to do when you're instituting the BIM process as well. One other piece of the puzzle, the sooner that you can get a firm grip on the major systems and types, the better the model is going to be from the beginning. For things like, partition width creep. If you're starting your model from a point of view where you already have a good idea of what the footprint or the building party or the size of the building is going to be, it's a good idea for a more savvy design professional group to begin the model with a little more refined pieces, like instead of a generic wall 6-inch within the software in Revit, for example, maybe you ought to take an initial stab at what the most likely stud size and partition size is, so that you don't down the road have this creep on dimensioning. And another piece of the puzzle is that if you've got major equipment designed or chosen up front in an IPD format or in a design assist up front, it's always a good idea to try to get the actual piece of equipment that is intended to be installed in right from the get-go, so that you have the major impacts of size and ducting and or structural components in up front as much as possible.
RJ, I think one of the things that you bring up some interesting points that we see a lot. Obviously CAD-1 is a software vendor and a services vendor, but our feeling around here too is that the software should be the tool that you do the work with, and that so often it gets confused with the real BIM thing itself. We have people call up and ask to buy a box of BIM, and so forth and so on. So you bring up some very interesting points that we see a lot when we're working with customers, where you have an architect who traditionally will design, let's say, a wall that's 50 foot high just because that's expedient for their part of the process, but then the contractor is having to go back and create a wall that's broken down for constructability or modeled for constructability. And that's something that I see that so often comes up as a question. First off, RJ, let me ask you to expound a little bit on that, and then Janet, if you could talk a little bit about some of the potential contractual issues. At one point you mentioned to me that you felt that in the next few years owners were going to be more savvy and demand better model because they know that it can be done and can save them money. So RJ, go ahead.
Well, I'll keep my comments brief because I could probably speak for a full hour on exactly that piece of it there, Stan. So I'll keep it brief by saying that a fellow architect peer of mine referred to BIM modeling software as putting the architect back in control of the design process. In a traditional format, it's all too often the case where the design principal, who has the big idea of what the building is going to be, will hand that off to somebody who's far more junior, far more inexperienced. And then there's a level of upfront intelligence of what the building could be that gets lost in that translation, and now you're back to just 2 lines on a screen that represent the wall. And the nice thing about architecture as it's evolving now is the architects at the more senior level are starting to get up to speed with the software enough that they can institute phasing, for example, like you mentioned. A 50-foot tall wall, well, maybe it's actually 5 walls, 10 foot tall each. There's a phasing to it, and you know that, so you design it that way up front instead of just doing a 50-foot tall mass. So that evolution that's coming around, where the more senior levels of the firm are actually more hands-on than they used to be because of that technology, is coming into effect little by little.
That's definitely a great point. I mean, definitely, because then you're starting to integrate things like systems and how parts are working together versus just lines on a drawing, and that's an excellent point there, RJ.
Well, and as you start to discuss levels of development, you start to realize that you can build in a lot of what is going to come in the next phase while you're doing one task, so that you gain a great deal of the expediency that BIM and VDC should promise to the industry. Janet, can you elaborate a little bit on what you think owners are going to start talking about as they realize what's available to them?
Uh-oh, is she muted?
Maybe
No, she's not muted, unless she muted herself. Maybe they went in the...
maybe she,
Okay.
Oh,
Is that better?
Yeah,
Is that
there
better?
you are.
Yeah. You know, I think that it's important to put this in the context of what an owner expects to buy for the millions and millions of dollars that they spend to design and construct a project. One of the things that owners have always been entitled to is a set of documents that's been coordinated and coordinated in the documents and coordinated in the field. So then when you have a coordination issue in the field that is going to cost a lot of money to change because it's already construction's already started, the question becomes, was the owner entitled to get the coordinated documents to begin with rather than paying to fix it in the field? And I think that the comment that I made that that Stan is referring to is that as the software becomes better and better capable of identifying conflicts and coordination issues on paper in the virtual world, I think it's a real question if something could have been caught in a clash detection or however else some of these things might happen in the process of coordinating sets of different sets of drawings. If something doesn't get caught and it gets out into the field and has to be changed, I think owners are going to be less willing to pay to change that after it's already been constructed incorrectly and has to be redone. So it's the rework that I think I was focusing on, and particularly rework that could have been detected using BIM. And this is in particular on a project where the owner has an expectation that people are using BIM. You know, when this first became a product or process on the marketplace, people were approaching owners and asking owners to pay more for BIM. I think we've kind of moved on beyond that, where people are now, whether you're a design professional or a contractor, the parties to the contract have seen so much efficiency and improvement just in their own bottom line that they're now not going to the owner and saying, well, I think you should pay me to use BIM on your project, but they're just using it because it helps them do their own business and do their own drawings in a more efficient manner. So we've kind of moved beyond that. But then I think the next phase is, you know, these things need to be detected when they can be detected for and corrected for little or no economic impact on the project.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think something that Brian actually mentioned earlier, and you were kind of alluding to, was, you know, we talk about BIM and there's been different stages of BIM, but really what we're getting into here is the actual model as being more of the deliverable at the end versus the traditional contract documents. And, you know, Janet, you were talking about the, you know, just doing the coordination between the two and just working out, you know, how the construction would be done and what things would take place, versus now the owner can take advantage of additional features he didn't have in the past with having the model. I don't know if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, what the owner might be looking forward to as far as beyond just a traditional set of construction documents.
Well, you know, I think that's a really good question, and it's because this process is in its infancy. There's some things that are actually, I think, being utilized today, and then there's other things that have potential that hasn't really been tapped, in my opinion, as deeply as it could be tapped. I think where the model is really giving advantages to owners is where they use it in their energy modeling for their buildings, especially if they're trying to get LEED certification. But even if they're not, you know, I think a lot of owners want their buildings to be more energy efficient, even if they don't take the final step to get a LEED certification. And the energy model is key to getting that energy efficiency. So owners are would much rather have a model to do a real building with real quantities, real areas, real square footages, to do their energy modeling, and I think that that's being utilized today in a very productive manner. I think there's other areas where owners could possibly use the model, but they haven't really decided if they want to use it. For instance, sometimes the things that owners are concerned about after a project is constructed are not the same things that the contractor is concerned about during fabrication and construction. So sometimes I think owners can use some portions of the model. Certainly if they want to do an addition, renovation to their building, they might be able to use the model. But then in other areas they're kind of starting over because they're keeping track of things in operations and management that contractors, quite frankly, don't have to think about. So they have a whole different set of issues, and they have to take the model in a different direction when the building is finished for operation and maintenance purposes. So there's a lot of opportunities out there, I think, that haven't really been fully developed in the final facilities management phase of the model.
I think hopefully I can just jump in.
No, go ahead, Brian.
I think that's a really good point. And sort of stepping back for a second, I mean, sort of a statistic that I'd like to tout out a little bit is that NIST in 2004 cited that the industry loses on an annual basis $15.6 billion a year, $15.6 billion a year due to lack of interoperability. And what Janet is talking about really goes to the heart of that. What I just recently heard kind of surprised me is that even when you do have some integration of sharing the models, that sometimes I've heard recently that architects they might develop a design model, the contractor his model, the owner has their model, and that even if they have access to the models, that they sometimes replicate it because of lack of interoperability between the different systems. You know, one of the things that I think from an industry-wide thing is that we want to see is greater sharing of information. Sometimes there's Autodesk and Rivet could be popular, and Bentley could be popular for a different segment of the industry. And so, you know, what we'd like to see is the systems to communicate to one another, and you'd have more efficiency, and then hopefully the owner at the end of the day would have specified the software and the protocols that they want so they can best utilize the model. But clearly there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and so hopefully we can get better so we don't have $15 billion annually that's lost in interoperability. So BIM promises some of that recapture, but I don't think we're there. I have heard a lot of contractors, when BIM is not part of the contracts or necessarily mandated by the process, but they take it on themselves, what I would call little BIM, just for clash detection. Yeah. And a lot of contractors take that on because they've seen really positive results from doing that and figuring it out in the office instead of the field, because it is a lot more expensive to figure out those clashes in the field, and the RFIs and the change order requests. You know, Janet hit on this, but that's what's going. I think we're getting past that because it's so demonstrated to be of value, even if you're not getting charged for it. That the increased efficiency of just doing clash detection makes using BIM a no-brainer. But like I said, I think the interoperability is another issue. One last thing, so if you look at the Consensus Docs BIM Addendum, one of the things that we have there, I think that's an important feature, is part of the BIM execution plan. There are different levels of reliance. Section 4.3.11 is that you actually have to have a conversation as part of your execution plan as to the level of reliance on the model. Is it for a lot of people use it for information only? When we were developing the document, that was clearly the most prevalent use of the models. And part of it is what I just said, is there, even if you are getting the models, sometimes people like to start over. But what I consider the best check-the-box option is for reliance on the dimensional accuracy of the contribution models. And that's getting to where you're starting to get some of the more powerful benefit of the model for ultimately the owner, and to be able to, not that the design the contractor can use and the owner can use. If we start getting the level, I think the industry is trending towards more reliance on the information, and that makes things more efficient in the process, especially when there's changes, if you can change the model, it automatically updates all the other outputs and design documents if you're pressing the sort of the print button there. And then the one last thing I would mention, that even if you are going to have full reliance on the model, one of the things in developing the consensus docs BIM addendum that surprised me is that my understanding is that no matter what you do, you won't have 100% reliance on the model. That there's always going to be things that you print out the design documents, or you're going to print out the documents and that you're going to make some hand drawings on. So that's another thing that you have to think about when you're setting up your contract process, is that there are going to be points where you're going to have to, especially if you're doing design bid build, you're going to obviously have to use the model maybe to spit out levels of details of things of that nature. But that's something, I don't know if that's something that RJ or somebody else can comment on, but that really surprised me that apparently you'll never have full 100% reliance on the federated model.
No.
No, I don't think you will. I think that, there's to your points, Brian, there's an interesting project here in Denver that where, kind of speaks to the owner-contractor relationship anyway, and that's the new IKEA store that opened here last fall. The project was brought in 3 months early and about $300,000 under budget because in part because IKEA as an owner knew that these tools were available and started saying, hey, we want to make sure that you use them. And the contractor in this case, very astute firm in the BIM VDC world, and so they use it, like you said, the little BIM portion of it, and between the two of them, they really created quite a fabulous project. And another thing that we're seeing, a couple of the clients that we work with here in the Rocky Mountain area are both owners. One is a hospital and one is a military operation, and both of them are basically stating, we want certain standards built into the RFP so that as this project progresses, we can have a reasonably reliable, or actually a highly reliable model that we can use for the life cycle management of the project. You're starting to see that more and more in government contracts especially. And so again, another thing that as business people in the audience really are going to have to start realizing is that these demands will be there and these expectations will be there, and BIM isn't just a cute way to, kind of the new CAD, as it were. RJ, you've worked a lot with, again, some of the government entities. What are your thoughts on what you're seeing as far as continuity of the model? And again, I realize that many times the words are there, but the what they actually know how to do with the model once they receive it is a whole nother animal. But at the same time, the contractual language is there for the deliverable.
That's correct. Jumping on a few things that Brian alluded to a minute ago, and also how your segue in ties. I have an anecdotal story before we talk about my governmental experience. 4 years ago, we built an 8-story hotel in the Denver metro area using load-bearing metal studs, which, as we all know, really doesn't normally go above, let's say, 4 stories. Mm-hmm. It was a specialty system, really sophisticated, and it had very finite tolerances as a result. It wasn't something that you just slapped up in the field. It was very highly engineered. We produced the project in Revit and issued out for shop drawings. This was a traditional design assist approach as opposed to an IPD, but we got inundated from the major sub who provides the system with an insane amount of questions preparatory to getting shop drawings from them, which they were doing in AutoCAD. And they were producing these shop drawings on AutoCAD based on 2D AutoCAD output that we had been required to do so that they could utilize it. And for about a week, we were getting pestered with questions. It was just an amazingly painful process until one day in passing, in the conversation with the lead shop drawer, he discovered that our AutoCAD documents were actually generated from a Revit model, and literally the conversation stopped and the questions stopped because he could trust, again, virtual modeling being what it is, he could trust, he felt, that what we had provided to him is actually what he was working with from a dimensional point of view. So going back to what you said earlier, Brian, it really was a powerful example of how BIM can be an efficiency. Moving on from that to interoperability and translation. You can have clients who, or owners who will dictate a particular model software. It does happen, and it's not necessarily a bad idea, because if everyone's working on the same software, you do have that efficiency. But it's amazing how often that doesn't fall through. I had a problem in a contract situation with a contractor where for the contract and for the design process, they were on board with everything being a Revit deliverable from the design team and from the subcontracting team. And at contract buyout, the contractor switched several subs because he could get a cheaper set, get a cheaper price. Again, this is more of a traditional contract as opposed to an IPD. Again, not realizing that in that switch out, he basically gave up any BIM sophistication in the subcontractor. Not to pick on contractors, but it can happen. You know, you got your eye on the bottom line, and this person's less expensive. Well, you may be giving up something, and all of a sudden there's a hole in your BIM process that has to be filled by somebody. That can be a tremendous pitfall, and perhaps maybe Janet can speak to it, but definitely a liability issue for whoever's trying to fill that hole. I don't know if, Janet, you had a comment on that or not. Not to put you on the spot, just curious what your thought was.
You mean changing, is the question changing subcontractors and then not having BIM capability?
Yeah.
No,
you
it's
know,
more along the lines of if something happens where a member of the team gets switched out for some reason and the replacement doesn't have that capability, all of a sudden there's a hole in the BIM model process that has to be filled in order to keep the project on time and on schedule. And,
well,
architects have a tendency
yeah.
to try to jump in and fill that hole to help out, but it's a liability.
Yeah.
Well, I have a couple comments about that. I think, first of all, it makes a big difference what that subcontractor was providing. If they were providing toilet partitions, I don't think you need to worry about it. If it was a structural steel subcontractor, then that's a different issue.
Yeah.
And I think what I've seen the more sophisticated general contractors do is the general contractor jumps in and fills the hole.
Mm.
And they do that, I hope, out of the recognition that by changing subcontractors, maybe they've saved some money. So and if they have the sophistication to do the modeling, then they just do the modeling themselves. Now, I'm not suggesting that a general contractor can model connections on steel beams. I think that could be a real problem. But most steel fabricators today and steel suppliers, they're some of the most sophisticated companies out there when it comes to BIM and BIM to fabrication and to the field. So it really, it's the answer that all attorneys like to give. It depends. It depends on who the sub is. It depends on who the general is. And it depends on what the project is. I mean, if you're talking about a complicated hospital, it could be a real problem. If you're talking about an office building, spec office building, you may not notice the difference.
True. What we see and what I was alluding to in the back of my head was actually more mechanical, plumbing, and electrical subs, because Revit is not as sophisticated in those as it is in the structure and in the architecture, although it's definitely evolving rapidly. So sometimes you get that really more when it comes to like mechanical equipment or electrical equipment. We see that.
Right. And you know,
Dan,
I think
oh, go ahead.
that leads into kind of an anecdotal story that I think would be appropriate to tell right now about a case that happened in Denver that was headed for litigation. It ended up settling, so I think that this is more anecdotal than actual hard fact. But there was a claim made from a mechanical subcontractor who was trying to, not a very sophisticated mechanical subcontractor, and they didn't apparently have any BIM capabilities, but they were putting mechanical equipment in a plenum, and the plenum was really tight, and the equipment would all fit in the plenum, but it had to go in a certain order in order for it to fit. And the contractor didn't figure that out until they had about half of the equipment into the plenum area, and then they submitted a change order to the owner because they couldn't fit all the mechanical equipment in. And I would have to assume, I never saw any documents, but I would have to assume that they were taking the position that it was a design defect, when in fact all of the pieces would fit. It just was a question of the order, and I think that the mechanical engineer took the perspective that it was means and methods, it wasn't design. And you know, ultimately the insurance company didn't want to make a precedential event out of this situation, and so the case eventually settled without actually, I think, even going through very much litigation. But I think the important point here is that you know, in the construction industry we don't run across this very much, but in the aerospace industry they run across it all the time. And mechanical engineers in the aerospace industry, if there's a particular order that they have to build their spacecraft in order to fit everything in, they always tell the contractor what their method is to fit everything in that space. And it's not a violation of the contractor's means and methods as long as they say, here's one way that you can put all this equipment in this space and it will fit. If you can figure out a better way to do it, then by all means feel free to find a better way to build the mousetrap. But there's a communication problem that I think is at the core of that conflict, and I think since we're talking about collaboration, it's appropriate to focus on this, because part of the communication and part of the collaboration is, if there's only one way to put the box together, tell somebody what that system is. That's part of the collaboration, I think.
Now, it seems to me that, and I'm sure Brian's chomping at the bit here, but it seems that the IPD process would be, you know, more inclusive of that kind of collaboration. I mean, that's kind of how that one's written. And I didn't know if Brian, you could elaborate on that. To me, it just seems like that contract exists for this very reason. When you go to switch something out, how is the team going to handle it versus, well, it's your responsibility, you figure it out.
Well, and I think just a quick comment, one of the things that I think is kind of, in a backhanded way, kind of humorous almost, is RJ's example of this contractor looking for cheaper contractors to do the job, watching the bottom line in the traditional sense, versus, hey, if we really got behind this BIM stuff, it might actually save us more money.
Yeah, so, the team itself.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, Brian, go ahead.
Well, that point you just made is, you know, the question: are you looking for value or are you looking for first cost?
Yeah.
And if you're an owner looking to build your team, or maybe a general contractor looking to build your subcontract team, you obviously in this market have to be very cost competitive. But the industry as a whole needs to start looking at the overall cost. And one of the components of IPD is that you look at a target cost, and then the team works together and then has incentives or risks if they don't meet it, is how to drive inefficiencies out of the process. So the target cost actually goes down, the owner can get better quality, and there's other factors that they can be judged upon, such as safety and things of that, even aesthetic quality, that can be judged to try to build a better team with a better overall cost, the life cycle cost, but really overall value. And I don't, like you said, you kind of already answered the question, to be honest with you. I mean, Janet set that up very nicely. It's almost like a softball. It is exactly that. I mean, traditionally, and we have contracts that are design, bid, build, but that is sort of how the industry is. It's fragmented in that if you start helping, if a design professional starts helping and getting mixed, God forbid that they start instructing a contractor or mandating means, methods, and techniques, there is that. They might be advised not to do that because that could affect their liability exposure. But when you start tying people's performance to work in a more collaborative fashion and have duties to do that, I mean, you certainly see that with design build and see them at risk. But it's obviously more evident when you have IPD, which usually goes along with co-location and on the daily meetings or weekly meetings to kind of go over that, where everybody's working together. It obviously helps with that, and now that things are more complicated and complex, again, there's more incentive, and that's why things are trending in that direction.
You know, I'd like to jump in now and make a quick comment about the definition of team too. We're all talking about you need a savvy team, and especially in an IPD program, project, you need to really have all those members of the team on the same level of sophistication. There are several more anecdotes I'd like to briefly share of situations where the definition of team really has to include an elaborate number of individuals. In one example, we had a situation where we had a pretty sophisticated design and construction team, and the owner was paying attention well, and the process was going well. But unfortunately, when the process, when the shovels began digging, so to speak, when the project turned over to actual in-the-field construction, that particular contractor's own in-house superintendency and field personnel did not share the same level of sophistication as the upfront project management of that contractor. And all of a sudden, it's another scenario, another situation where a savvy BIM model and process can start to falter because the field personnel aren't also part of that team. That's a critical piece too. The actualization of the BIM model in the field can fall apart if you've got a more traditional contractor subset. So that group also has to be a part of the team. And then another anecdote briefly is that with the federal government, you can have so many entities that you're dealing with and so many geographical components of that entity that the entity that's writing the contract might be very savvy about not only the contractual content of the BIM model, but the understanding of the software and the utilization and the granularity. But then the actual receiving agency might have absolutely no idea what a BIM model is whatsoever. So the contract says you have a BIM deliverable at the end of the project, fully as-built, and you're delivering a very impressive model with all the linked subset models and with all the as-built incorporated, et cetera. And it's literally the case where often a government recipient at that particular installation will receive that item, often a DVD, check it off the list as having received it, and then it goes into a drawer, and it never gets opened, and it never gets seen again. And I'm not denigrating those personnel, but they just haven't been trained, especially with an enormous agency like the entire federal government. You can see an unevenness in that. But then all of a sudden, all that effort, all that BIM model work is going literally into a dustbin. And that's a little frustrating from the point of view of having delivered it.
And that's one of the, RJ, that's one of the things that we see a lot from our end of things right now. A lot of architects in the region are pretty savvy, structural engineers, even many of the MEP firms, they're probably bringing up the tail a little bit still, but where the process so often breaks down and people ask us to come in and consult with them a bit is just that. Okay, the subs, the people in the field, how do we get good information out there? And then, like you say, many of the situations where the owners just go, well, I want this as a deliverable, but then what?
Yeah, they don't know what they're asking for, and they don't know what they have when they get it, and it just falls apart at that point. I mean, you can have the whole design team and the build team on board, but you're absolutely right, RJ. When that gets to the owner, it's a waste of effort. It's a waste of man hours to get that out there. It is. It really is. What I'd like to do is, since we're getting down to the end here, is I wanted to get everybody's final thoughts, and then we have a couple of questions or several questions from the audience we'd like to pose to everybody. So I'd like to first start off with Janet and just get some closing thoughts on what we're kind of wrap up your thought process here, and then we'll ask some questions from the audience. So we'll start with you, Janet.
And Janet, hold on. But by the way, I want everybody to know, because many of you may have to leave here pretty quick, I do want you to know that I am very thankful to Janet, Brian, and RJ for participating today. They all are in business as well in various degrees. So if you're looking for contractual help, legal help, advice, please think about calling Janet's firm. If you're looking for someone to consult with on a BIM project or a design project, RJ is an excellent resource there. And then Mr. Pearlberg, being with the AGC is in a little bit different category, but at the same time, I know that AGC has a number of resources that can help you there, and I'm sure if you sent an email to Brian, he would help direct you to the right resource channel to help you if you have additional questions. So with that, let's go ahead, and Janet, if you could finish up with a few thoughts.
Janet.
Janet?
Can't hear you.
Uh-oh. Maybe.
Brian?
Okay, now? Is that better?
There we go. There we are.
First I wanted to, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to, okay, good. Wanted to thank Brian Pearlberg in particular for his views and perspectives on this. It's, I can't tell you how much it means to an attorney to be able to actually engage in some lively back and forth with someone of Brian's stature who really understands the issues on construction contracting. So this has been really delightful for me. But anyway, I'd like to go back and make a couple of parting comments about the multi-party contracts and the fact that I think we need to bear in mind that there are some projects where you're not going to be able to use multi-party or relational contracts for a variety of reasons. And RJ has pointed out the prime example. Federal contracts, the Federal Acquisition Register does not, or regulations do not allow multi-party or relational contracts. Our federal government as well as our state and local governments are not allowed to share risks with our tax money, my tax money, and I'm kind of glad that they don't. They're not allowed to use my tax money to share the risk with private companies. So the idea of risk sharing and profit pooling is just not really possible in the public sector, and I for one am not advocating that should change. It's, you know, our tax dollars are very important, and I'm not sure that relational contracts and risk sharing is the way to spend our tax dollars. I think that there are a lot of things that can be added to relational contracts in the way of incentives for meeting schedules, incentives for design initiatives, contingencies, sharing profits below a certain level that go a long way towards getting the project participants motivated using two-party contracts. But I don't want us to lose focus of the fact that there are a lot of cultural changes that our industry needs to make and can make regardless of what kind of contract you have. You can use lean principles on any project. You don't have to have a three-party contract to use lean principles and all the wonderful concepts that come along with that. So let's make sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and ignore all the wonderful opportunities for collaboration and an improvement of our industry just because we still have to use two-party contracts in a lot of places.
Great. Thank you very much, Janet. Now we'll go to RJ and get a little bit of RJ's parting words.
A couple of brief items wanted to mention in any kind of contract, which includes any conversation regarding BIM, that the granularity level can be very challenging if you're not careful. Because granularity gets to such a technical proficiency level with the understanding of the software and the design process that you oftentimes have people agreeing to or writing or demanding contents of contracts when they really may not be at the level of sophistication necessary to understand what they're asking for. So granularity can be really dangerous. If they're asking for quarter-inch pipe, you know, throughout the model and every line of Romex, you've got an issue. Another thing that I wanted to mention, you know, when it comes to intellectual property rights for the model, architects, I know some architects who insist that the traditional legal enforceable method remains a paper set of documents. And then I have other architects who say, you know, in the end, you should give the model away. You should literally just give it. And then what you do is that you can use that as a marketing for operations and maintenance down the road, which I know Brian is part of a subsequent seminar. So I've seen both sides of that table. I'm not necessarily agreeing with one or the other. I think a lot of it has to do, again, with what team are you involved with, owner, contractor, architect, design group. What team are you involved with, and what project are you working on that kind of alludes to who owns that intellectual property at the end of the process.
Great. Thank you very much, RJ. Now we'll hear from Brian, and then we'll just take some questions from the audience. So, Brian, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you, Janet, for your kind comments, and I couldn't agree more that it's been a pleasure with the conversation today. And I actually should probably back up a couple of things, because I actually agree with what you said, and I may have come across as like being a purist as far as the definitions, but I'm certainly strongly encourage folks to kind of move in this continuum of exploring this issue, and to encourage the. I think BIM is kind of the tipping point is here. AGC has actually written a white paper, a couple of them, but one is the development of IPD and the levels of collaboration, and it talks about moving along that line. But I'll tell you, the Consensus Docs BIM Addendum is very clear. It encourages the use of BIM wherever pre-construction services is appropriate for a project. So it could even be design, bid, build with a level of pre-construction services as part of the project where you can use the BIM Addendum. And because BIM is such a powerful tool, it's worthy of consideration. All too often, the risk profiles, or that people say that legal risks are an obstacle not to use BIM. But in developing the Consensus Docs BIM Addendum, we see it as actually the opposite, is that it's actually potentially a risk mitigation tool. Let me briefly talk a little bit about IPD and the multi-party contracts. There's two different types of IPD type of contracts. After Consensus Docs 300, that is a multi-party IPD agreement where everybody signs the same contract. However, there's not a single-purpose entity or an LLC that's created to do the project. The AIA has published a document that does that, and that presents some insurance and licensing issues that you avoid if you have the structure of a multi-party. And subsequently, AIA came out with another version of their documents that more closely aligns with the multi-party. So I think there's a coming together between the integrated form of agreement, the Consensus Docs 300, and the third version of the AIA document, that multi-party is the way to go, but not a single-purpose entity for IPD. But again, let me also say that design build offers a lot of that collaboration. And I would just add one thing, is that I used to actually be general counsel at the DBIA, Design Build Institute of America. And one of the things, the best practices for design build, often it's thought of as a risk-shifting method from the owner to not be involved and not to be actively involved. But at DBIA, the way I think that a lot that I've heard is that active involvement by the owner actually helps successful design build, and that level of engagement can be very productive for better project outcomes. So with that, again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. Look forward to hearing the questions.
All right, great, thank you. And I just wanted to point out to our audience there that this is just the first of 4 parts. We're going to be looking at more of the nitty-gritty, the actual BIM portion of the work. The next one being how we're going to be handing it off between the design team members, and who's going to be taking over what kinds of roles. So we'll be talking more about the consensus documents and the E202, and kind of how the inner workings are going to go between each of the disciplines. So with that, I'm going to get to the first question here. It says, I understand that under the consensus documents, general conditions, the shop drawings are considered part of the contract for construction and hence become the responsibility of the architects and engineers. How can the architects and engineers deal with the BIM Revit modeling?
I believe that question's for me.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to take it. Actually, it's a great question. In 2007, we came out with our general terms and conditions. They're integrated in the contract, so it's not like one document is the A201 general conditions and then you have a separate agreement. So the Consensus Docs 240 is the owner design professional agreement, and the 200 is the owner constructor agreement, and both of them have individual general conditions. In 2007, our general conditions did have, as the questioner indicated, that the shop drawings were contract documents. And then, like I said, we had 20 groups. We had a lot of people involved in that. And then we published our documents, and we got some feedback from the industry, and actually in January 2011 came up with revisions to our prime agreements, our 200, the 240, the design build 410, the 500 construction management agreement is the 500, and our subcontract the 750. In that revision, we actually made a change. I think one of our competitive advantages is that we're active listeners and that we're lean and able to respond to the industry in a proactive fashion rather than wait 10, 20 years to make changes. In 2011, we did make that change. It's something that feedback we got from design professionals and owners that shouldn't be an opportunity. However, with the one caveat is that in the Consensus Docs 300, that is still the case because of the level of integration that's appropriate to leave shop drawings as contract documents. So we heard you. We made the change, and we'll never attain a perfection, but we're constantly seeking to come out with the best contract possible.
Well, thank you.
Oh, and one more thing I forgot to mention is if you go to, speaking of resources, if you go to the website consensusdocs.org, there's a lot of tools, articles, comparisons, more detailed legal analysis, as well as sample documents. And the BIM Addendum is, I think it's an excerpted sample, and if that's not enough, if you just email info@consensusdocs, we're happy to give education samples of documents like the BIM Addendum.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if any Janet or RJ had anything to add to that, but it seems like Brian's pretty well covered it. So I'll get to the next one. How does the E202 work with design, bid, build, project delivery? And I think we've kind of gone over that a little bit, but I'll just throw that out there again to see if anybody else has any more to add into that. So let's see if RJ might be one to take on this.
Can you repeat the question, please?
How does the E202 work with the design, bid, build, project delivery?
Oh, I think at that point, again, it gets back to what Janet said at the very beginning. Who are the members of your team and how sophisticated are they? In a traditional design, bid, build process, you may have an owner who is very savvy about what BIM can do and what the contents are, and then therefore they can adopt pieces and parts of the E202, or you may have an owner who does not. So really at the inception, it starts to depend on who you're talking about from in terms of a contractor and an owner who's working with you in that aspect. It's all about that contract.
One thing that we've noticed too, and we don't get involved in contracts certainly, but we've noticed from the market that as the economy moves through different cycles, the preferable contract models seem to change too, because obviously you can get a much more competitive environment. You're going to a design build contract may seem to benefit the owner more than, say, some other contractual model. And we heard that a lot over the past few years that, oh, you used to do this, now we're doing this. Now, again, I'm no way legally minded, but at the same time, I think that's something that's an interesting factor as well. We could probably go on all afternoon about that. But.
Yeah, it seems to me that the question itself, the design, bid, build project just isn't going to quite lend itself for it. And you're right, RJ. It's going to come down to the team itself, whether it succeeds or fails as a project itself.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, you can use little BIM, but you can use an individual doing clash detection on their own, but the protocols amongst team parties, it's a hard fit. It's possible, but it just doesn't have as much benefit when you're talking about fragmented design bid build. That's like a hard bid and such.
Yeah. I have another question here. I think this one's for Brian, but I think it just goes back to what you're talking about before. It says, could you repeat the 3 prongs of the IPD process?
So there's organizational structure, and that has a lot to do with making sure you have the right culture internally and communication skills and such that we've talked, I think, a lot about today. Then there's the other term is the commercial terms. So what is your risk sharing? What is your rewards? What is the limitation of liability? Do you have a safe harbor provision? What happens, consequential damages if things fail? Those are things that are part of your commercial terms. And then another important part is the operating system. And one of the differentials of the consensus docs is that we do address things like pull planning. Operation systems are that I think we're agreeing that drive waste out of the system. That's something that's the cutting edge. I don't know if it's bleeding edge, but that's going towards using some of your lean principles, your real-time deliveries, including reliance of BIM models. But that's your operating system, and that would be the third peg.
All right. Thank you. Another question is, why does BIM substitute the responsibility of the material takeoffs from the contractor to the design team?
I don't know
Yeah.
who that one is directed. We may hang on to that one for the next session. I think it might be a little more lined up with that.
Yeah, that's definitely going to come into play more on when we're talking with the whole team itself. So I'll get to
sounds similar to the shop drawings, possibly. Though.
Yeah. And then the last question here, what are the thoughts on using the AIA E202 on non-IPD projects? I guess they're asking, is it okay to strip out authorization to use models for cost estimating?
Janet, do you have any sort of liability, or Brian, and then RJ, I could use your thoughts?
I think Janet has something to say on this, I thought.
Go ahead.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. What are the thoughts on using the AIA E202 on non-IPD projects? Is it okay to strip out authorization to use the model for cost estimating?
Well, you know, I'm not sure that I understand really where the focus is on this. You know, an integrated project delivery process would encompass getting the contractor involved early, doing cost estimating, and maybe that's the question. Can you use it just for cost estimating and not for drawings? Is that? I'm not quite sure that I understand the question.
I think so. I'm going to see if
I'm
Michael.
struggling here. I think, yeah, I'm going to take a. I mean, I don't know if you're able to have interaction with the questioner, but it does look like in Article 3 of the E202 that it says that the model may be used for development of a cost estimate based on current area and volume and similar. But you know, the standard documents they're all you're able to modify all of them, and if I at the risk of being wrong here and not being an expert on the E202, I mean, I think that you can modify the E202 for something that's for design build or something like that. I just think it's a little hard a bit of a fit with design bid build. What do you think, Janet? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think you could use the E202 with design build, or integrated project delivery with any meaning integrated project delivery is any form of contract where you are using a model. You can't do an estimate off the model if you're not doing a model. So I think it's kind of hard to carve out the cost estimating because there's nothing to estimate if you don't have the model. So that's, and in some respects that's you know, contingent on having an accurate model where you can get accurate quantities. So I think that it's very appropriate to have it in the E202, and I'm not sure that you could do the cost estimating alone without the model, without everything else that goes along with the model.
And there's some decent tools with cost estimating and so forth coming online, but there's a lot of intricacies to that, as well as pulling things from the model. So that could be a whole nother discussion itself that maybe we'll do for you all sometime.
Yeah, I think it stands right. It's, you know, we're getting into other things of liability. You know, if you're not part of the IPD process, what liabilities do you get into with that? You know, who's responsible if things are wrong? That really gets to a whole nother level.
So we're at 3:30. And you know, our panelists have devoted a lot of their valuable time to this session. So, and as our audience. So, with that, we're going to close it off today. We want to thank everyone who's participated or listened in. We hope there was a lot of value to it. Again, our sincere thanks to to Janet, Brian, and RJ, and it means very much to us that you participated, and we'll be talking to you soon. But in the meantime, the rest of you, look forward to the next session on April 24th, same time period, and we'll get some MEP and architect and structural people in here and talk about that end of things. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, everyone, and
thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.